The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet downtown streets as Walter Johnson made his way down Maple Avenue. At 68 years old, he still walked with the straight back and steady pace that had been drilled into him during his military days. His weathered hands gripped a small gift bag containing a book he'd picked out for his granddaughter, Lisa. Today was special. She was graduating from nursing school, and he wouldn't miss it for the world. Walter adjusted his old Korean War veteran cap, a habit he'd developed over the years. The cap meant something to him. It reminded him of the young man he'd been, fighting for his country in a war most people had forgotten about. Back then he'd been strong and fearless. Now with gray hair and lines around his eyes, he sometimes wondered if people saw him as just another old man shuffling through life. But Walter was far from just any old man. Those who knew him understood that beneath his gentle smile and quiet demeanor lived someone who had seen more of the world than most. He'd served 3 tours in Korea, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and came home to a country that didn't always appreciate his service. After the war, he'd worked as a mechanic for 40 years, raised 3 children, and helped countless neighbors with everything from fixing cars to mediating disputes. The downtown area was slowly coming to life. Shop owners were opening their doors, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the corner cafe. Walter nodded politely to Mrs. Chen as she arranged flowers outside her shop. She waved back with a warm smile. This was his neighborhood, the place where he'd lived for over 30 years. He knew every street corner, every shortcut, and most of the people who called this area home. As he walked, Walter thought about Lisa and how proud he was of her. She'd worked 2 jobs to pay for nursing school, studying late into the night while caring for her younger brother. The book in his bag was about famous nurses throughout history. He hoped it would inspire her as she started her career helping others. 3 blocks away, Officer Derek Mills was having a very different kind of morning. He sat in his patrol car, parked in the shade of an old oak tree, watching the street with the kind of attention that made people uncomfortable. Mills had been a police officer for 15 years, and in that time, he'd developed some very specific ideas about how things should work in his city. Mills wasn't the kind of officer who saw his job as protecting and serving everyone equally. To him, some people belonged in certain areas and others didn't. He'd grown up in this city, and he remembered when downtown looked different. When different kinds of people lived here, change bothered him, and he'd made it his personal mission to keep what he called order in his patrol area. The radio in his car crackled with routine calls, but Mills wasn't really listening. He was watching the people on the street, categorizing them in his mind. The woman walking her dog was fine. She lived in one of the expensive apartments nearby. The businessman checking his phone was acceptable. He probably worked in one of the office buildings. But Mills had a problem with anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of who belonged in this part of town. Mills had a reputation among his fellow officers. Some avoided partnering with him because of his attitude. Others had tried to talk to him about his approach to policing, but Mills didn't listen. He'd received multiple complaints over the years, citizens reporting that he'd been rude, aggressive, or unfair. Each time the complaints had been investigated and filed away. Mills had learned to be careful about what he did and said when other officers were around. The thing about Mills was that he was smart enough to avoid getting into serious trouble, but not wise enough to change his ways. He'd perfected the art of making people feel unwelcome without quite crossing the line into behavior that would cost him his job. A questioning look here, an unnecessary request for identification there, a comment that could be interpreted different ways depending on who was listening. On this particular morning, Mills was feeling especially irritated. He'd had an argument with his supervisor the day before about his approach to community policing. The supervisor had suggested that Mills might benefit from some additional training in cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Mills saw this as criticism and had spent the evening stewing about it. As Walter continued his walk toward the college campus, he passed a group of young people waiting at a bus stop. They were laughing about something one of them had said, and their joy was infectious. Walter smiled, remembering what it felt like to be young and full of possibilities. He'd been like that once before the war, before life taught him that the world could be harsh and unfair. The students reminded him of Lisa. She had that same energy, that same belief that she could make a difference in the world. It's why she'd chosen nursing. She wanted to help people heal, to be there for them during their most vulnerable moments. Walter had tried to warn her that the world might try to discourage her, that she might face challenges that had nothing to do with her abilities or character. But he'd also taught her to be strong, to stand up for herself, and to never let anyone make her feel like she was worth less than she was. Mills noticed the group of young people too, but his reaction was very different from Walter's. He saw them as loud and disruptive. In his mind, they were probably up to no good, even though they were simply waiting for public transportation like hundreds of other people did every day. This was how Mills's mind worked. He looked for problems where none existed, and he often found what he was looking for, whether it was really there or not. The patrol car's engine rumbled to life as Mills decided to drive slowly down the street. He told himself he was just doing his job, keeping an eye on things. But really, he was hoping to find someone to hassle, someone who would give him a reason to exercise the authority that he sometimes felt was slipping away from him. Walter was about halfway to his destination when he stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. He checked his watch. He had plenty of time before Lisa's ceremony. She'd told him not to worry about being early, but Walter believed in punctuality. It was a value from his military days that he'd never lost. As he stood there, Walter thought about all the changes he'd witnessed in his lifetime. He'd seen his country fight wars, struggle with civil rights, celebrate victories, and mourn losses. He'd learned that progress was slow and sometimes painful, but that it was worth fighting for. He'd also learned that there were always people who resisted change, who preferred the way things used to be, even when the way things used to be wasn't fair or just. The light changed and Walter crossed the street, unaware that his path was about to intersect with Officer Mills in a way that would change both of their lives forever. Sometimes the most significant moments begin in the most ordinary ways. An old man walking to see his granddaughter graduate. A police officer starting what he thinks will be just another routine day. Neither Walter nor Mills knew that in just a few minutes, their encounter would become a story that people would talk about for years to come. Walter had just crossed Pine Street when he noticed the police car rolling slowly beside him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police cars were a common sight downtown, and he'd always believed that law enforcement officers were there to keep everyone safe. He continued walking at his steady pace, his mind still focused on Lisa's graduation ceremony. Officer Mills drove alongside Walter for nearly a full block, studying him through the passenger window. Something about the elderly man bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the confident way Walter carried himself. Or perhaps it was simply that Mills didn't recognize him as someone who belonged in this part of town. Whatever the reason, Mills felt compelled to stop and investigate. Mills pulled his patrol car to the curb just ahead of Walter and stepped out. He was a tall man with a thick build, and he had a way of using his physical presence to intimidate people. His uniform was crisp and his badge gleamed in the morning sunlight. To most people, he looked like the very picture of authority and professionalism, but those who knew him well could see something else in his eyes, a coldness that had nothing to do with maintaining law and order. "Excuse me, sir," Mills called out as Walter approached. His voice was polite on the surface, but there was an undertone that suggested this wasn't really a request. "I need to speak with you for a moment." Walter stopped and turned to face the officer. Years of military training had taught him to show respect for authority, even when he didn't necessarily like the person wielding it. "Good morning, officer," he said politely. "Is there something I can help you with?" Mills walked closer, positioning himself so that Walter would have to crane his neck to look up at him. It was a subtle intimidation tactic that Mills had perfected over the years. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he said, pulling out a small notepad as if he was preparing to write down information. Walter raised an eyebrow, but remained calm. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "I'm just walking to see my granddaughter graduate from nursing school." The question seemed to irritate Mills. In his experience, most people simply complied with his requests without asking questions. When someone pushed back, even politely, it triggered something defensive in him. "Sir, I don't need a reason to ask for identification. It's a routine check. Now, do you have your ID with you or not?" "I understand you have a job to do, officer," Walter replied, his voice still respectful but firm. "But I also know my rights. I'm not driving a vehicle. I'm not suspected of committing a crime, and I'm simply walking on a public sidewalk. Unless you can tell me what law you believe I might have violated. I don't believe I'm required to provide identification. A few people on the street had begun to notice the interaction. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran a small grocery store nearby, paused while sweeping her front steps to watch what was happening. A young couple walking their dog slowed their pace, sensing that something was wrong. None of them intervened, but their presence meant that Mills couldn't behave quite as aggressively as he might have if no one was watching. Mills felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't going the way these encounters usually went. Most people, especially older people, became nervous when confronted by a police officer and simply did whatever he asked. But Walter wasn't showing any signs of fear or submission. If anything, he seemed more confident than Mills was comfortable with. "Look, sir," Mills said, his tone becoming harder. "I can do this the easy way or the hard way. All I'm asking for is a simple ID check. Are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have a problem?" Walter studied the officer's face for a moment. He'd encountered men like Mills before, people who used their position to bully others, especially those they perceived as vulnerable or different. During his years in the military, Walter had learned to recognize this type of personality. He'd also learned that backing down to bullies usually only made them bolder. "Officer," Walter said calmly, "I'm a United States veteran. I served 3 tours in Korea, and I've lived in this city for over 30 years. I pay my taxes, I vote in every election, and I've never been arrested for anything more serious than a parking ticket. I'm walking to see my granddaughter receive her nursing degree, which makes this one of the happiest days of my life. Now, if you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I'll cooperate fully. But if you're just trying to hassle an old man for walking while black, then we have a problem." The directness of Walter's response caught Mills off guard. Most people didn't confront him so openly, and they certainly didn't mention race. Mills looked around and noticed that several people were now watching them. One person had pulled out their phone, though Mills couldn't tell if they were recording or just checking messages. "Did you just play the race card with me?" Mills asked, his voice rising slightly. "I don't see color, sir. I see suspicious behavior. An elderly man walking alone in this area, carrying a bag, refusing to cooperate with a police officer. That raises red flags for me." "Suspicious behavior?" Walter repeated, genuinely confused. "I'm walking to a college graduation. I'm carrying a gift for my granddaughter, and I'm refusing to give up my constitutional rights just because you asked me to. None of that is suspicious unless you're looking for reasons to be suspicious." By now, several more people had stopped to watch the confrontation. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved closer, pretending to adjust the produce display outside her store, but clearly listening to every word. The young couple with the dog had stopped completely, no longer even pretending to be just passing by. A businessman waiting at the nearby bus stop had lowered his newspaper and was watching openly. Mills realized that the situation was attracting more attention than he wanted, but he also felt like he'd gone too far to back down now. In his mind, Walter was challenging his authority in front of witnesses, and that was something he couldn't allow. Mills had built his reputation on being the kind of officer that people didn't argue with, and he wasn't about to let an elderly man damage that reputation. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to provide identification," Mills said, stepping closer to Walter. "If you continue to refuse, I'll have to assume you're hiding something, and I'll be forced to take you into custody for obstruction." Walter felt his heart rate increase slightly, but not from fear. It was the same feeling he'd had decades ago when facing enemy soldiers who thought they could intimidate him. He'd learned long ago that bullies only understood one language: strength. Not physical strength necessarily, but the strength that came from knowing you were right and refusing to be pushed around. "Officer, I want you to listen very carefully," Walter said, his voice still calm but now carrying the tone of command that had once ordered young soldiers into battle. "I am not obstructing anything. I'm not hiding anything. I am exercising my rights as an American citizen. If you want to arrest me for that, then go ahead. But understand that there are witnesses here, and this conversation is probably being recorded. Are you really sure you want to arrest a 68-year-old veteran for walking to his granddaughter's graduation?" Mills looked around and saw that Walter was right. At least 3 people now had their phones out and pointed in their direction. The businessman at the bus stop was definitely recording, and he'd been joined by a woman who appeared to be live streaming the encounter on social media. The officer felt trapped. He'd started this interaction expecting easy compliance, but instead he'd found himself in a very public confrontation with someone who clearly understood his rights and wasn't afraid to exercise them. Mills knew that backing down now would make him look weak, but escalating further might create problems for him later. The tension on the sidewalk was thick enough to cut with a knife. Walter stood his ground, calm but alert, while Mills struggled with what to do next. The growing crowd of witnesses watched in silence, sensing that they were about to see something that would stay with them for a long time. Neither man knew that this moment would soon explode into something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. The standoff lasted for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Mills could feel the eyes of the growing crowd on him, and each passing moment made him more uncomfortable. He'd backed himself into a corner, and now he had to choose between admitting he was wrong or doubling down on his aggressive approach. Pride won out over wisdom. "That's it," Mills said, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and failure to cooperate with a police investigation." "Investigation of what?" Walter asked, still maintaining his calm demeanor. "You still haven't told me what crime you think I've committed?" Mills didn't answer the question. Instead, he grabbed Walter's left arm and started to turn him around to place him in handcuffs. "Put your hands behind your back now." This was the moment when everything changed. Walter had been willing to talk, even willing to be arrested if it came to that. But when Mills grabbed his arm roughly and started to manhandle him, decades of military training kicked in. Walter's body remembered lessons learned in hand-to-hand combat classes, and his instincts recognized the difference between a lawful arrest and an assault. "Officer, please don't put your hands on me," Walter said firmly, pulling his arm away from Mills's grip. "If you're arresting me, I'll cooperate, but there's no need for force." Mills interpreted Walter's movement as resistance, and it triggered something ugly inside him. All the frustration he'd been feeling, all the anger about being questioned and challenged by this elderly man suddenly boiled over. Instead of stepping back and de-escalating the situation, Mills chose to escalate it dramatically. "Don't you dare pull away from me," Mills snarled, grabbing Walter's arm again, this time much more aggressively. When Walter again tried to maintain some distance, Mills lost control completely. The officer shoved Walter backward with both hands, sending the elderly man stumbling toward the brick wall of the building behind him. Walter's back hit the wall hard, knocking the wind out of him and causing him to drop the gift bag he'd been carrying for his granddaughter. The book inside scattered pages across the sidewalk. Gasps went up from the crowd of witnesses. Mrs. Rodriguez covered her mouth in shock. The young woman who had been live-streaming the encounter made sure her phone was capturing everything clearly. Several people shouted, "Hey!" and "Stop!" but no one physically intervened. Walter stood against the wall for a moment, catching his breath and assessing the situation. This was no longer about constitutional rights or proper police procedure. This had become a physical assault by someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community. Walter realized that Mills had crossed a line, and that his own safety was now in question. "Officer, you just assaulted me," Walter said loudly, making sure the witnesses could hear him clearly. "I was not resisting arrest. I was not threatening you. You just attacked an elderly citizen for no reason." Mills was beyond listening to reason now. The adrenaline was flowing, and all his training about de-escalation and proper use of force was forgotten. He saw Walter's calm response as defiance, and it made him even angrier. In Mills's mind, Walter was supposed to be afraid now, supposed to submit to his authority. The fact that the old man was still standing there talking about his rights was infuriating. "Shut up and turn around," Mills demanded, moving toward Walter again. "Put your hands behind your back right now, or I'll put them there for you." Walter could see that the officer was out of control. Mills's face was red with anger, his fists were clenched, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he might be capable of serious violence. Walter had seen that look before, in war zones and in dangerous situations throughout his life. It was the look of someone who had lost all self-control. When Mills reached for him again, Walter made a decision that would shock everyone watching, including Mills himself. Years of military training had taught Walter that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, especially when dealing with someone who was clearly intent on doing harm. As Mills lunged forward to grab Walter's arm, the elderly man stepped to the side with surprising agility. Mills's own momentum carried him forward, off balance, and Walter used a simple defensive technique he'd learned in the Army. He grabbed Mills's outstretched arm, stepped to the side, and used the officer's own weight and motion to send him stumbling past him. Mills crashed into the brick wall where Walter had been standing just moments before. He hit it shoulder first, hard enough to scrape his uniform and leave him stunned for a few seconds. The watching crowd was silent, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. Walter immediately stepped back and raised his hands, palms open where everyone could see them. "I was defending myself," he announced clearly, making sure his voice carried to all the witnesses. "This officer assaulted me first. I have a right to protect myself from unlawful violence." Mills pushed himself away from the wall, his face now purple with rage and embarrassment. Being outmaneuvered by a 68-year-old man in front of all these people was the most humiliating thing that had ever happened to him as a police officer. His pride was wounded even more than his shoulder, and that made him dangerous. "You just assaulted a police officer," Mills shouted, reaching for his radio to call for backup. "You're going to jail for the rest of your life." "I defended myself." "From your unlawful assault," Walter replied calmly, though his heart was pounding. "Everything that just happened was recorded by multiple witnesses. I never attacked you, I simply prevented you from attacking me again." The crowd was now openly supportive of Walter. Several people were shouting comments like, "Leave him alone." And he didn't do anything wrong. The woman who was live streaming had attracted viewers from around the country, and comments were pouring in supporting the elderly veteran. Mrs. Rodriguez had seen enough. She walked over to where Walter was standing and positioned herself between him and Mills. "This man shops in my store every week," she announced loudly. "He helps elderly customers carry their groceries. He's never caused trouble for anyone. You're the one who started this fight." Other witnesses began speaking up as well. The businessman with the phone confirmed that he'd recorded the entire encounter from the beginning. The young couple verified that Walter had been walking peacefully when Mills first approached him. One by one, the people who had watched the confrontation made it clear that they all saw Mills as the aggressor. Mills realized that the situation had spiraled completely out of his control. What was supposed to be a simple intimidation of an elderly man had turned into a public relations nightmare. He was now facing a crowd of hostile witnesses, multiple recordings of his behavior, and the embarrassing reality that he'd been physically outmaneuvered by someone nearly twice his age. But Mills wasn't ready to give up. His radio crackled as he called for backup, and he knew that other officers would be arriving soon. In his mind, he could still find a way to arrest Walter and justify his actions. All he had to do was make sure his version of events was the one that made it into the official report. Walter could hear the tension in Mills's radio calls and knew that more police officers would be arriving soon. He also knew that his life could depend on how the next few minutes played out. The witnesses were on his side for now, but police officers tended to support each other, regardless of the circumstances. Standing on that sidewalk, surrounded by scattered pages from his granddaughter's gift, Walter realized that what had started as a simple walk to a graduation ceremony had become something much bigger. This was no longer just about him or his rights. This had become a moment that would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and standing up for what was right. The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, and Walter knew that the most challenging part of this encounter was still to come. Mills stood by his patrol car speaking rapidly into his radio, and Walter could hear fragments of what he was saying. Words like "suspect assaulted officer" and "requesting immediate backup" drifted across the sidewalk. Walter knew that Mills was trying to control the narrative before other officers arrived, painting himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack. The crowd of witnesses had grown larger as word spread about what was happening. People were coming out of shops and offices to see what the commotion was about. Many of them recognized Walter from the neighborhood and couldn't believe what they were seeing. To them, the idea that this gentle elderly man could be a threat to anyone, especially a young police officer, was absurd. Walter remained calm, but his mind was working quickly. He'd been in dangerous situations before, and he knew that the next few minutes would be crucial. When the backup officers arrived, they would naturally be inclined to believe Mills's version of events. Walter needed to make sure the witnesses and their recordings couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Everyone who saw what happened, please don't leave, Walter called out to the crowd. I'm going to need you to tell the truth about what you witnessed here today. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded firmly. We're not going anywhere, she said. We all saw who started this. The businessman who had been recording held up his phone. I got the whole thing, he announced. From the very beginning, anyone who wants a copy can have one. The young woman who had been live streaming was still broadcasting, and she was providing commentary for her viewers. This elderly veteran is being harassed by this police officer for no reason, she was saying. The officer got physical first, and when the man defended himself, the officer lost his mind. Mills finished his radio call and turned back toward Walter, his face still flushed with anger and embarrassment. He could hear what the witnesses were saying, and he knew they weren't supporting his version of events, but he'd already committed to his story and now he had to stick with it. Sir, you are under arrest for assaulting a police officer, Mills announced loudly, pulling out his handcuffs again. Turn around and put your hands behind your back now. Walter looked at the crowd of supporters around him, then back at Mills. Officer, I think you should wait for your backup to arrive before you do anything else. You're clearly upset, and I don't think either of us wants this situation to get any worse. It was good advice, but Mills was beyond listening to reason. The humiliation of being outmaneuvered by Walter had wounded his pride so deeply that all he could think about was regaining control of the situation. In his mind, arresting Walter would somehow restore his authority and dignity. Mills approached Walter again, this time more cautiously. He'd learned from their previous physical encounter that the old man was more capable than he looked, but Mills was still confident that his youth and size would give him an advantage if it came to another physical confrontation. I said turn around, Mills repeated, reaching for Walter's arm again. Walter stepped back slightly, keeping his hands visible but maintaining some distance. Officer, please don't put your hands on me again. If you're going to arrest me, you can do it without violence. But Mills was beyond caring about proper procedure. He grabbed Walter's wrist and tried to force his arm behind his back. Walter, however, was ready this time. Years of training kicked in again, and he responded with the same calm precision he'd shown before. Walter twisted his wrist in a way that broke Mills's grip without causing injury to either of them. It was a textbook defensive move, designed to escape from an attacker without escalating the violence. But to Mills, it felt like another humiliation, another challenge to his authority that he couldn't allow to stand. Mills tried to grab Walter again, this time with both hands, attempting to bear hug him and force him to the ground. But Walter was ready for this too. He stepped to the side, let Mills's momentum carry him forward, and then used a simple leverage technique to redirect the officer's energy. Mills found himself stumbling forward again, this time nearly falling face first onto the sidewalk. He managed to catch himself with his hands, but the result was even more embarrassing than their first encounter. A ripple of surprised laughter went through the crowd as they watched the young police officer being consistently outmaneuvered by a man old enough to be his grandfather. Did you see that? Someone in the crowd called out. The old guy's like a ninja. Mills pushed himself up from the ground, his uniform now dirty, and his pride completely shattered. He could hear people in the crowd making comments about his incompetence, and he could see some of them recording his humiliation for posterity. The knowledge that this encounter was being broadcast live to who knows how many people made his embarrassment even worse. Walter, meanwhile, had barely moved from his original position. He stood calmly with his hand still raised, demonstrating to everyone watching that he wasn't the aggressor in this encounter. His breathing was steady, his expression was calm, and he showed no signs of the exertion that Mills was clearly feeling. This is self-defense, Walter announced clearly, making sure his words would be picked up by all the recording devices pointed in his direction. I am not attacking this officer. I am simply preventing him from attacking me. I have the right to protect myself from unlawful violence regardless of who is committing it. The crowd murmured their agreement. To everyone watching, it was obvious that Walter was the victim in this situation. Mills was the one who had initiated physical contact. Mills was the one who kept escalating the violence. And Mills was the one who was out of control. Mills could hear the sirens getting closer, and he knew that other officers would be arriving within minutes. He also knew that when they got there, they would see him looking disheveled and defeated while Walter looked calm and composed. The optics of the situation were terrible for him, and he was smart enough to realize it. But Mills wasn't ready to give up. In his mind, Walter had somehow tricked him or gotten lucky. The idea that a 68-year-old man could legitimately outmaneuver him in a physical confrontation was something his ego simply couldn't accept. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Mills snarled, circling Walter like a predator. "You think these people are going to protect you? Let me tell you something, old man. When my backup gets here, we're going to sort this out the right way." Walter turned slightly to keep Mills in sight, but he didn't respond to the taunts. He'd dealt with bullies before, and he knew that they often got more dangerous when they felt cornered. Mills was clearly feeling cornered right now, which meant Walter needed to be extra careful. The crowd was getting restless. Several people were calling out for Mills to leave Walter alone, and the general mood was becoming increasingly hostile toward the officer. Mrs. Rodriguez had been joined by several other shop owners, all of whom were vouching for Walter's character and expressing their outrage at Mills's behavior. The woman who was live streaming was providing regular updates to her viewers, and the comment stream was overwhelmingly supportive of Walter. People from around the country were watching this confrontation play out in real time, and their reactions were universally critical of Mills's conduct. Walter could see that Mills was becoming more agitated as the crowd's support for him became more vocal. He'd seen this pattern before. Bullies often became most dangerous when they realized they were losing control of a situation. Walter prepared himself for the possibility that Mills might try something even more desperate before backup arrived. The sound of sirens was very close now, and everyone on the sidewalk could see the flashing lights reflecting off the buildings around them. In just a few moments, this confrontation would enter a new phase, and Walter knew that his fate might depend on what kind of officers responded to Mills's call for help. As the first patrol car rounded the corner, Walter took a deep breath and prepared himself for whatever came next. He'd stood his ground this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. Two patrol cars arrived almost simultaneously, their sirens wailing and lights flashing. Officers Patricia Coleman and Robert Hayes stepped out of the first vehicle, while officers Jennifer Park and David Chen emerged from the second. All four officers quickly assessed the scene. A disheveled Mills facing off against a calm elderly man, surrounded by a crowd of agitated witnesses. Officer Coleman, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for fairness and professionalism, immediately took charge of the situation. She'd worked with Mills before and had always been concerned about his approach to policing. Seeing him in his current state, with his uniform dirty and his face red with anger, raised immediate red flags for her. "What's the situation here?" Coleman asked, positioning herself between Mills and Walter. Mills started talking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain his version of events. "This suspect assaulted me. I was conducting a routine investigation and he became violent. He needs to be arrested immediately for assault on a police officer." But before Coleman could respond, the crowd erupted in protests. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "That's not what happened at all. This officer attacked that man for no reason. All Mr. Walter was doing was walking to his granddaughter's graduation." The businessman with the phone held up his device. "I recorded the whole thing. The officer was harassing this gentleman, and when the man stood up for his rights, the officer got physical first. Officer Park, who had been quietly observing the scene, noticed that multiple people were holding phones and recording devices. She also noticed the scattered pages from Walter's gift bag and the defensive positions both men had taken. Her training told her that this situation was more complicated than Mills was making it seem." Coleman raised her hand for quiet and addressed Walter directly. "Sir, I'm Officer Coleman. Can you tell me what happened here?" Walter straightened his shoulders and spoke in the clear, measured tone he'd used during his military service. "Officer, I was walking to see my granddaughter graduate from nursing school when Officer Mills stopped me and demanded identification. When I asked what law I had violated, he became aggressive. I tried to de-escalate the situation, but he chose to become physical. I defended myself using minimal force necessary to prevent him from assaulting me further." "He's lying," Mills interrupted. "He attacked me. He assaulted a police officer." Coleman held up her hand to silence Mills, then turned to the crowd. "Did anyone else witness this encounter from the beginning?" Nearly every person in the crowd raised their hand. One by one, they began to tell their stories, and a clear pattern emerged. Every witness confirmed that Mills had approached Walter first, that Mills had escalated the situation, and that Walter had only used physical techniques when Mills became violent. The young woman who had been live streaming stepped forward. "I've been broadcasting this whole thing live. Thousands of people watched it happen in real time. The footage is already going viral on social media." Officer Hayes, who had been examining the scene, picked up some of the scattered pages from Walter's gift. He read the title of the book, Heroes in White, Inspiring Stories of Nurses Throughout History, and looked at the gift bag with, "Congratulations, Lisa," written in careful handwriting. "Sir," Hayes said to Walter, "is this your granddaughter's graduation gift?" Walter nodded. "Yes, officer. Lisa is graduating from the nursing program today. I was walking to the ceremony when this all started." Coleman was beginning to get a clearer picture of what had really happened. She'd seen Mills in action before, and this scenario fit his pattern of behavior perfectly. But she'd never seen him lose control quite so completely, and she'd certainly never seen him get physically outmaneuvered by someone he was trying to arrest. "Mills," Coleman said firmly, "I need you to step back and let us handle this." Mills looked at her in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? This man assaulted a police officer. He needs to be arrested." Officer Chen, who had been quietly reviewing the video footage on the businessman's phone, walked over to Coleman. "Patricia, you need to see this," he said quietly, holding up the phone. Coleman watched the video from the beginning, seeing Mills approach Walter, escalate the situation, and then initiate physical contact. She watched Walter defend himself with minimal force while clearly stating that he was acting in self-defense. The video made it obvious who the aggressor was in this encounter. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading rapidly through social media. The live stream had been shared hundreds of times, and news outlets were already picking up the story. Veteran Defends Himself was trending on multiple platforms, and support for Walter was pouring in from around the country. Officer Park had been speaking quietly with several of the witnesses, taking their statements and contact information. Every single person she spoke with corroborated Walter's version of events. Many of them knew Walter personally and vouched for his character, describing him as a helpful neighbor and respected member of the community. Coleman made her decision. She walked over to Mills and spoke to him in a low voice that the crowd couldn't hear. "Derek, you need to calm down and think about what you're doing. Every witness here contradicts your story. There's video evidence that shows you initiating physical contact. If you try to arrest this man now, you're going to create an even bigger problem for yourself." Mills stared at her in disbelief. In his mind, other officers were supposed to support him automatically, regardless of the circumstances. The idea that Coleman would take the side of a civilian over a fellow officer was something he hadn't expected. "Are you seriously going to let him get away with assaulting me?" Mills demanded. "Derek, you assaulted him," Coleman replied bluntly. "I've seen the video. You grabbed him first, you shoved him against the wall, and you continued to be aggressive even after he asked you to stop. He defended himself, and he had every right to do so." The crowd had been watching this exchange, and when they realized that the supervising officer was not going to support Mills's false narrative, a cheer went up. Mrs. Rodriguez started clapping, and soon the entire crowd was applauding Coleman's fairness and professionalism. Walter remained calm throughout all of this, but inside he felt a tremendous sense of relief. He'd been prepared for the possibility that all the officers would close ranks and support Mills regardless of the evidence. The fact that Coleman was willing to look at the situation objectively gave him hope that justice might actually prevail. Coleman approached Walter and extended her hand. "Sir, I want to apologize for what happened here today. Officer Mills' behavior was completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that this is not how we train our officers to interact with the community." Walter shook her hand gratefully. "Thank you, officer. I understand that most police officers are good people trying to do a difficult job. I don't hold you responsible for his actions." Coleman then turned to address the crowd. "I want to thank everyone who stayed to provide witness statements. Your cooperation is essential to making sure the right thing happens here. This incident will be fully investigated, and appropriate action will be taken." Officer Hayes approached Walter with the scattered pages of his granddaughter's gift. "Sir, I think these belong to you," he said, helping to gather up the book and put it back in the gift bag. "Thank you," Walter replied. I hope I can still make it to Lisa's ceremony. How far do you have to go? Hayes asked. Just about 6 more blocks to the college. Hayes looked at his watch. Would you like a ride? We can have you there in a few minutes. Walter smiled for the first time since this whole ordeal began. That would be very kind of you, officer. As Walter got into the back of Hayes's patrol car, the crowd cheered again. Mrs. Rodriguez called out, "Tell Lisa we're all proud of her," and other neighbors shouted their congratulations and well wishes. Mills stood by his patrol car, watching in stunned silence as Walter was driven away by the very officers he'd called for backup. Coleman approached him with a stern expression. "Derek, you're going to ride back to the station with Chen and Park. You're suspended pending a full investigation. You need to turn in your weapon and badge immediately." Mills stared at her in disbelief. "You're suspending me? For what?" "For excessive use of force, for harassment, for filing a false report, and for conduct unbecoming an officer," Coleman replied. "And Derek?" "This time, there's video evidence that can't be ignored or explained away." Within hours, the video of Walter's encounter with Mills had been viewed millions of times across various social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, and Walter found himself being interviewed by reporters about his experience. He used every interview as an opportunity to talk about the importance of knowing your rights, standing up to bullies, and treating all people with dignity and respect. The college where Lisa was graduating invited Walter to speak at future events about courage and standing up for what's right. Community groups asked him to teach self-defense classes for seniors. Most importantly, his granddaughter told him that she'd never been more proud to be his family. Mills, meanwhile, faced serious consequences for his actions. The investigation revealed a pattern of similar behavior that had been overlooked or covered up in the past. He was terminated from the police force and faced both civil and criminal charges for his assault on Walter. The incident sparked important conversations about police accountability, the rights of citizens, and the courage it takes to stand up to injustice. Walter became an unexpected symbol of dignity and strength, proving that standing up for what's right is never a mistake, regardless of your age or circumstances. As for Lisa's graduation ceremony, Walter made it just in time to watch his granddaughter receive her nursing degree. When he gave her the book about heroic nurses, she told him that he was her hero too. After everything he'd been through that day, those words meant more to him than any medal or recognition ever could. The story of Walter's courage spread far beyond that downtown street corner, inspiring people everywhere to stand up for their rights and treat others with the respect and dignity that every human being deserves.